The news arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, in the midst of a downpour lashing against the windows of the small studio where Darrow usually painted. The drumming of the rain on the glass seemed to set the pace of the phone call that broke his concentration. On the other end of the line, the measured voice of a lawyer informed him of a puzzling event. A distant relative, once a renowned artist, had passed away and, in his will, had named both Darrow and Rodrigo, his half-brother with whom he barely had contact, as heirs. There was no family house, nor a sum of money, but rather an old art workshop that had enjoyed great fame decades before. The rain intensified, underscoring the tension building up in Darrow. Although he had studied fine arts and devoted himself to painting, he never imagined receiving such a peculiar artistic legacy. He also realized he'd have to deal with Rodrigo to organize and preserve that workshop, which did not thrill him. Since adolescence, his relationship with Rodrigo had been lukewarm at best. They knew of each other's existence, had shared a few weekends during family gatherings, but never forged a close bond. This announcement promised to bring them into constant friction, likely kindling heated disputes. The most surprising clause in the will was that the workshop couldn't be sold immediately. Instead, the two heirs were required to renovate and manage it for a certain period. The lawyer, with a slight note of apology in his tone, explained to Darrow that this condition was driven by the artist's explicit wish to prevent his legacy from being lost in the hands of strangers. It was a final act of romanticism or caprice that would, no doubt, force both brothers to collaborate. After Darrow hung up, he stood gazing at the brushes and tubes of oil paint on his work table. There was an almost ironic sense that, being the introverted painter so passionate about classical techniques, he was now on the verge of managing a place that had once been the creative epicenter of a much-acclaimed artist. Even more disquieting was the thought of Rodrigo. What would he do with an art workshop? He had always been more pragmatic and distant from artistic sensitivity. Can I endure this joint venture? Darrow wondered, his stomach in knots. The city where the workshop was located lay a few hours away by train. The next day, Darrow packed some materials, his preferred brushes, a sketchpad, and some clothes, and set off. As the train glided through landscapes of fields and small villages, Darrow recalled the few moments he had spent with Rodrigo, afternoons at the park, bittersweet family celebrations, and the growing gap that arose as each defined his own path. Rodrigo was always surrounded by friends, practical projects, and a lively demeanor. Darrow remained locked in his room with his sketches and art books. Upon reaching the station, nostalgia washed over him. The historic district was famous for its colonial houses, cobblestone streets, and small cafes with live music in the afternoons. Amid the warmth of the colorful facades lay the perfect setting for an artist. Yet his mind kept returning to the inherited workshop and the imminent meeting with Rodrigo. At the hotel where Darrow would temporarily stay, he discovered at reception that Rodrigo had already come by asking for him. It was the first sign of his half-brother's unease. Perhaps he wanted to be sure to coordinate a joint visit to the place. Feeling a slight tremor of anxiety and curiosity, Darrow took a quick break to freshen up, then set out to find the address provided by the lawyer. Their reunion happened on a narrow street. From a distance, Darrow noticed Rodrigo's figure, tall, carrying himself with confidence. Upon seeing him, Darrow felt a jolt of tension in his chest. Rodrigo lifted his gaze. Their eyes met in a silent exchange, and they approached each other. The greeting was polite, almost formal. There was a mutual wariness. Darrow feared that his artistic passion would clash with the need to modernize, while Rodrigo suspected Darrow would cling to outdated, unprofitable methods. They exchanged courteous words, tension filling the air, and each perceived an unexpected hint in the other's gaze. "I'm sorry about our relative," Darrow murmured, unsure what else to say. "Yeah, and I'm sorry he dragged both of us into this," Rodrigo replied, a half-smile tinged with sarcasm. Despite the coolness of their words, both felt an inner stirring, an inexplicable curiosity that made them notice not just the potential disputes, but also the shared nervousness. The place referred to in the will as a sanctuary of art stood behind a worn wooden gate. As soon as they approached, the squeak of rusty hinges accompanied the gate opening, revealing a wide inner courtyard with wilted flowers and an old well in the center. Rodrigo frowned and started snapping photos of the damage, while Daro walked more slowly, allowing himself to be enveloped by the dilapidated charm. A couple of cats darted away at their arrival, and a mix of dust and oil paint permeated their senses. They crossed the courtyard and arrived at the main hall, a space with high ceilings, broken glass panels, and columns that once supported large easels. On the walls were colorful paint stains interspersed with charcoal sketches, testifying to the history of a creator who had once enjoyed great acclaim in this space. Rodrigo ran a hand over the back of his neck. "This needs a hefty investment," he said with a sigh, his eyes moving quickly, mentally tallying costs and envisioning what he deemed a necessary overhaul. Daro, on the other hand, approached an old armchair stained with dried oil paint. He ran his fingertips over the fabric, as though trying to absorb the place's artistic past. "We need to rescue its artistic soul. We can't just modernize it," he insisted, with a mixture of tenderness and determination. This was a place of creation, not just a commercial property. Their conversation grew tense. Rodrigo proposed discarding nearly everything to start from scratch, while Daro insisted on restoring it and preserving its original spirit. It was obvious this clash of visions would shape their future disagreements. Still, when their eyes happened to meet, both felt a sudden flutter in their stomach. There was more than annoyance or suspicion. A connection simmered beneath the surface, incomprehensible and even unsettling to them. In the midst of their inspection, Daro found an apparently forgotten sketchbook in a corner. Upon opening it, he discovered drawings of human figures in various artistic poses, with marginal notes speaking of passion, love, and pain. As he studied its pages, a shiver ran through him. The late artist hadn't just left behind paintings, but personal jottings revealing impossible loves, family tensions, and a quest for beauty amid chaos. Rodrigo came closer, noting Daro's expression. He read a few lines and fell silent, surprised by the intensity of those writings. Suddenly, the old artist's history took on a tragic, romantic nuance that resonated with the strange discomfort they themselves were feeling. Could it be an omen of what might happen to them? At some point in their exploration, both their phones rang. The lawyer was calling to remind them of urgent formalities. They had to submit a renovation plan to City Hall soon, or risk losing the property. This added pressure created a sense of urgency, forcing Daro and Rodrigo to spend more time together and collaborate intensely. "Within 2 weeks, I need a report on what you intend to do with the workshop. There's no quick sale option," the lawyer emphasized over the phone. Ending the call, they exchanged looks. Rodrigo's fast plan of a no-nonsense renovation and Daro's romantic idea of respectful restoration were being compelled to converge. While organizing a few wobbly chairs and stacking canvases in a corner, a silence thick with tension settled in the workshop. Rodrigo, frowning, let out a sigh. "No matter what, we'll have to work closely together." "Yeah," Daro replied, not daring to look up. "Hope it doesn't turn into a disaster." Rodrigo stopped tidying up and looked at him intently. The echo of his footsteps resonated as he approached, and Daro felt his presence just inches away. A slight blush appeared on Daro's cheeks, not fully understanding why he felt that sudden tingle. The workshop, with its oil-stained walls and silent memories, seemed to watch them, as if hoarding secrets waiting to be uncovered. "I'm sure it won't," Rodrigo muttered, attempting to sound confident. "They say 2 opposing visions can create something extraordinary." In the dim light filtering through a broken skylight, time seemed to stand still. Both sensed this scene was the beginning of a different kind of relationship, perhaps more intense than any typical fraternal bond. Without voicing intentions, they parted ways to their respective lodgings, aware that the following day would mark the official start of a joint venture, with challenges transcending the mere management of an old art workshop. Their first afternoon of work consisted of cleaning and organizing. Daro placed salvageable canvases in a corner and discarded those with mold or irreparable tears. Rodrigo, for his part, took inventory of what they might sell or auction off to raise funds. However, at one point, Daro came across an old yet beautifully crafted easel. "Are you going to throw this out too?" Daro quipped, noticing that Rodrigo had relegated it to a pile of expendable items. "I'm not saying throw it out, but maybe sell it if we can get a more modern one," Rodrigo replied. "That easel looks kind of flimsy." "It isn't. It's obvious you don't appreciate the real value of things." Darrow muttered his frustration as he carefully lifted the easel. The atmosphere turned tense. Their eyes met, a slight blush appearing on both of them, having nothing to do with anger. In that small tug of war, their hands brushed against the wood at the same time, and suddenly, their fingers met. "Sorry," Rodrigo said, looking away. "It's okay," Darrow whispered, feeling a slight tremor in his chest. The contact lasted only a second, but it was enough to cause a shiver that spread through both of their bodies. Although they kept silent, neither could ignore the spark that seemed to ignite with every touch. With his mood soured after their dispute, Darrow secluded himself in a corner of the workshop to paint. He chose one of the old easels, found a fresh canvas, and proceeded to sketch a landscape from memory. Intrigued, Rodrigo approached to watch. The silence was tense, yet curiosity drove him forward. "Can I see?" he asked in an unusually soft tone, from behind. Darrow hesitated for a moment before nodding. As he moved the brush, each stroke was firm and meticulous, as though painting were his way of processing what he felt. Observing the colors Darrow mixed, Rodrigo felt a sudden respect. He also felt something else aflutter in his stomach while looking at his half-brother's focused expression. He was surprised to find himself wondering why that scene seemed so magnetic. By nightfall, Darrow set down his brush. Meanwhile, Rodrigo had organized a few tools and sorted through old catalogs. Their stomachs growled at the same time, and they realized they hadn't eaten anything since morning. They decided, then, to head out to a nearby cafe. Amid the scent of roasted coffee and the cozy dimness of the place, they sat at a secluded table. They began by chatting about childhood, about memories of family, simple anecdotes, jokes about each other's mischief. In that relaxed atmosphere, Rodrigo admitted, "Sometimes I think Dad or the family always wanted me to be more like you, sensitive, artistic. And did that bother you?" Darrow asked, curious. "No, well, maybe a bit at first. But I realized." Rodrigo looked up, noticing Darrow's interest. "I've always liked how you are, even though you sometimes drove me crazy by being so sensitive." Darrow smiled shyly. He hadn't expected that confession. He felt a warmth fluttering in his chest, a warmth he couldn't quite name, a mix of pride and tenderness. They returned to the studio with their takeout bags, laughing at an anecdote Rodrigo shared about his failed attempt at cooking when he lived alone. The atmosphere in the space felt different from how they had left it. The silence was no longer heavy, but warm, as if the studio itself was coming alive in their presence. Noticing that the main light was still broken, they turned on portable lamps and rearranged a couple of desk lamps, tilting them to illuminate the table where they set up their impromptu dinner. The elongated shadows of their movements danced on the walls, creating a play of light that resembled the controlled chaos of an impressionist painting. "This place is, I don't know, it's special," Rodrigo commented as he sat down. Darrow looked up from his food, intrigued. "Special how?" "I don't know," Rodrigo shrugged, searching for the right words. "Like it has a memory. Like it's waiting for someone to give it purpose again." Darrow nodded, recalling the notes he had found in their relative sketches. "Maybe. It just needs someone to listen." His words hung in the air, laden with a depth neither of them was ready to explore in that moment. As they ate, Rodrigo noticed a large frame covered with a sheet in one corner of the studio. He put his plate aside and silently approached it, pulling back the fabric. What he revealed left them both speechless, an unfinished portrait of a young man who bore a striking resemblance to Darrow. "Is that?" Rodrigo frowned, glancing between the face in the painting and his brother. Darrow stood and stepped closer to examine it. "I don't know. I've never seen this before." The portrait had a vivid, almost hyper-realistic style, but what stood out most was the expression on the young man's face, a mixture of longing and melancholy that seemed to leap off the canvas. Rodrigo stared at it intently, as if trying to decipher a hidden message. "It's unsettling, but beautiful," Rodrigo murmured. Darrow nodded, feeling an inexplicable connection to the portrait. Though he didn't know who it was, He sensed that this painting held a story waiting to be uncovered. They decided to set the portrait aside for the time being, but its discovery had altered the energy of the night. Darrow returned to his canvas, trying to focus, but his mind kept wandering back to the painting and to Rodrigo, who was now flipping through old sketches on the other side of the studio. At one point, Darrow noticed that his easel wasn't properly adjusted. "Can you help me with this?" he called out. "I can't get it to stay in place." Rodrigo put down what he was doing and walked over, kneeling to adjust the base screw. As he worked, his hand brushed against Darrow's, and both froze for a moment. "Are you always this close when you help?" Darrow teased, trying to ease the tension. Rodrigo smiled, though there was an intensity in his gaze that belied his casual tone. "Does it bother you?" Darrow shook his head but said nothing. They returned to adjusting the easel, but the closeness between them was undeniable. The dim lighting and the studio's quiet seemed to amplify every small movement, every accidental touch. When they finished, Darrow leaned back toward his canvas to resume painting. Rodrigo, curious, lingered by his side, watching every stroke. "How do you create that effect?" Rodrigo finally asked, pointing at the shadows in the landscape. Darrow hesitated before answering. "It's about practice, and really observing." Rodrigo picked up a nearby brush. "Can you show me?" Darrow looked at him, surprised by the genuine interest in his voice. "Sure, hold the brush like this." He leaned closer, guiding Rodrigo's hand. The contact between them lasted longer this time. As Darrow moved the brush smoothly, Rodrigo wasn't focused on the canvas but on him. The way Darrow's eyes tracked each stroke, the slight curve of his lips when a line turned out just right, it captivated Rodrigo in ways he wasn't ready to admit. When they finished, Rodrigo set the brush down and stepped back to take in the painting. "It's beautiful," he murmured. Darrow turned to look at him, noticing the sincerity in his voice. "Thanks." The silence that followed wasn't awkward but heavy with something neither of them could name. The shadows from the lamps danced on the walls, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to the space they shared. "You know, I always thought you were complicated," Rodrigo said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Darrow raised an eyebrow. "Complicated?" Rodrigo smiled, though there was a hint of melancholy in it. "Yeah, but now I see you just see the world in a way I don't entirely understand." Darrow felt a warmth spread through his chest, unexpected, but not unwelcome. "Maybe it's not that complicated. Maybe we just look at things from different angles." Rodrigo nodded, his gaze fixed on Darrow. The moment hung between them, suspended in the air. Though neither took a step forward, both knew something had shifted. As the hours passed, fatigue began to set in. To unwind, they sat on the paint-stained floor, leaning against the wall. They talked about their family history and how tensions had always existed. Darrow with his misunderstood sensitivity, and Rodrigo with his practical ambitions. Slowly, they began to understand each other better, uncovering insecurities that each had carried alone. At one point, Rodrigo let out a shaky sigh. "You know, this place gives me goosebumps. It feels like it holds an aura of intimacy." Darrow's heart raced as he turned to look at him. "It's as if our relatives passed, as an artist still lives in these walls." Without intending to, they fell silent. Darrow noticed Rodrigo's gaze fixed on him, and a tingling sensation traveled down his spine. Slowly, Rodrigo shifted his hand on the floor, inching it closer to Darrow's, until their fingers almost touched. That faint contact ignited a palpable electricity between them. They stared at each other, confused and anxious. Neither knew how to define what was happening, but they both understood that their bond had transcended conventional brotherhood. A mixture of nerves and yearning coursed through them. Darrow broke the silence, his voice trembling. "I don't understand. What's happening between us? It confuses me." Rodrigo, equally uncertain, whispered back. "Me too, but I can't deny. There's something that pulls me toward you." The honesty of those words left them more exposed than ever. Pretending normalcy was no longer an option. In the dim light of the studio, surrounded by brushes and canvases, they looked at each other with a newfound openness. Rodrigo swallowed hard, leaning just enough for his shoulder to brush against Darrow's. The moment hung by a thread. Their breathing quickened, and Darrow's lips parted slightly, trembling. Rodrigo, with deliberate gentleness, raised a hand and brushed Daro's cheek. It was a soft gesture, almost as if asking permission to cross the barrier between them. Daro felt a pleasant shiver run through his body. Closing his eyes for a moment, he allowed himself to be vulnerable, while a warmth he couldn't deny filled him. Slowly, he rested his forehead against Rodrigo's shoulder, not daring to go further, but silently embracing the closeness. They ended up sleeping a few hours on old mattresses and blankets they found in the storage room. They didn't discuss what had transpired, but their proximity was inevitable. Two people who had recognized a deeper bond. When they awoke, the morning light filtered through the broken windows, illuminating the dust particles floating in the air. They prepared a makeshift breakfast of instant coffee and stale bread they had brought with them. The atmosphere felt lighter, though charged with meaningful silences. As they ate, they found themselves smiling. Naturally, the strangeness of the previous night hadn't vanished, but had transformed into something less unsettling. "What's the plan for today?" Daro asked, seeking a safe topic. "I guess we'll keep fixing things, but..." Rodrigo paused, looking at him. "Can we continue tonight? Painting together? I mean," a spark lit in Daro's eyes. "Painting, yes." But behind that word lay the promise of continuing to explore their newfound closeness. He nodded, unable to hide his timid smile. Throughout the day, they worked on the studio, buying paint for the walls, patching up leaks, and cleaning windows. They debated colors and space allocation. Rodrigo preferred a minimalist style, while Daro leaned toward something classic, but their arguments were playful rather than hostile. Every elbow brush, every lingering glance, fed the simmering tension between them. By late afternoon, they sat in the courtyard, planning their next steps. In the soft light of dusk, Rodrigo admitted, "I don't know how this feels for you, but I can't ignore what happened last night." Daro swallowed hard. "Neither can I, and it scares me, but I feel it's not something we can deny." The fear of judgment from their family or society loomed in their thoughts, but the warmth of the studio seemed to offer them temporary refuge, a space where they could dare to feel. That night, after finishing a few brushstrokes together and tidying up the easels, they found themselves once again in the studio's soft shadows. As Daro cleaned the brushes, Rodrigo approached him from behind and whispered, "Would you dare to paint something with me? From scratch?" "How do you mean, together?" Daro asked, his heart racing. "You and me. One brush, one canvas. Letting our hands be guided by what we feel. Double quotes. It was a metaphor for what their lives could become, an uncertain stroke. A collaborative creation where each color and movement would emerge from the blend of their personalities and the flood of emotions they had discovered. Daro nodded, his timid smile returning. Together, they prepared to create that first piece, not just art, but the story they were beginning to write or paint together.